See, that wasn't good enough. Good morning, NCC. How's everybody feeling this morning? Great. I only heard Jack. How's everybody feeling this morning? We'll work on that. Well, good morning. We are definitely glad to see you all look beautiful. I see some of you got your hair did. We're glad to see you this morning. This morning, we're actually starting a new series in preparation for Easter, and we're calling this series Scandal. Now, some of you, I know you have watched that show, so we're in no way telling you to watch or not to watch the show. But we do want to talk about a few things and a few issues that oftentimes people have with Christianity and following Christ, and what's the big deal about this whole Easter thing. And so over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about this series called Scandal. Now, I want to kind of set this new series up so you know where we're coming from. And so I want to go immediately to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. Let me read you what Paul says. He says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? And where is the teacher of the law? And where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." That word that Paul uses called stumbling block is the same word that we get our English word for scandal. In other words, that people in those days had a lot of questions. And people in those days, just like in the days that we live in, have a lot of objections. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people in Paul's time considered this whole Jesus story to be one of the biggest scandals that ever be told. It's one of the biggest scandals that have ever happened, and people are confused and people don't understand. And so we're hoping over the next 4 weeks that we can unpack some of the reasons why God does what he does. Remember, Paul says it's the foolishness of preaching. It is what we consider to be intelligent that God makes and takes and looks at and makes it for us to understand that it's not so intelligent. And the things that don't make a whole lot of sense to us, God is able to take and make a lot of sense out of. And so over the next 4 weeks, we want to address this scandal. This morning, we're going to talk about the scandal of the cross. Now, I want to do something with you this morning because I work with teenagers and we play a lot of games. So I want to play a word game with you this morning. Is that all right? Now, here's what I want to do. When I show you the word, I want you to all yell out the opposite of that word. Can we do that? So we got the instructions down? So we'll have a word that's going to pop up on the screen, and your job is to yell out the opposite of that word. We ready? All right, let's get the first word. Up. Let's go to the next one. Left. Let's go to the next one. Dog. You guys are smart. Next one. Hand. All right. Go to the next one. Good. All right. Here we go. Next one. Fair. Ah. How many said unfair? Anybody over there? Here's what we want to deal with this morning. Is that there are basic human assumptions to how God works. And the reality is that the opposite of fair is not unfair. The opposite of fair is actually grace. There's a story about me. The other day I was invited to go somewhere, and I kind of knew where I was going, but I wanted to make sure that I was going in the right direction. And so I took out my phone and pulled out my little GPS app, and I typed in the address, and for some reason it just kept giving me the wrong directions. And then I pulled over and I put it back in again, and it gave me the wrong directions. And because I had a sense of where I was going, I knew that it was telling me to go the wrong direction. And after about 10 minutes of sitting in the parking lot, not being able to figure out why it was telling me to go the wrong way, I realized that the problem is that it had the wrong starting point. See, GPS is wonderful, and Yahoo Maps and all these different tools we have now to get us to where we're going, they're wonderful, but they're only effective in as much as you can start in the right spot. That if you're ever in the wrong spot and you're trying to get somewhere else and it thinks that you're somewhere starting off different than where you are, it's not going to be very helpful. This is why I say this. It's because for a lot of us, whether you're a Christian or not, or we have friends who are Christian or not, and we begin to have these objections and questions, a lot of times it's because we just simply start in the wrong place. See, for most of us, we think that the story of the cross and the gospel of Jesus Christ has everything to do with us, but that's not the right place to start. As a matter of fact, grace, you'll come to find out, has nothing to do with us, but it has everything to do with God. And so we have to start in the right place. There's basic human assumptions. Now I want to read something from Matthew. And Jesus tells this story in this parable in response to two situations. One, he had a young man come to him and ask him, what do I need to do? What laws do I need to keep in order to inherit eternal life? In other words, how do I get in, Jesus? What are the things I need to do? How much work do I need to put in so that I can become right with you? And in the end of that conversation, Jesus says, you know what? You say you've done all these things. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. And Matthew says that he went away depressed. And because of that, the disciples said, well, wait a minute. We've also given everything that we have, and if it's harder for a rich person to get through the eye of a needle than to get to heaven, then, or if it's harder than the camel to go through the eye of a needle for a rich person to get into heaven, and we've given up everything, their question was, well, who can be saved? And then Jesus goes on to tell this story. Because the beginning of it and his response to the question was, the question that was posed was, how much can I do? Or how much can I give? What is it that I need to do to get in there with you, to be right with you? Or how much do I need to pay? How much can I give? And Jesus tells this story in response to a question that started in the wrong place. Matthew chapter 20. Let's read this for a second. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Now, it's a pretty long story, but I think it's worth reading through the whole thing. Listen to the story that Jesus tells in response to this situation. He says, for the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. And he agreed to pay the normal day's wage, and he sent them out to work. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing around doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard, and at noon again, and at 3 o'clock he did the same thing. And at 5 o'clock that afternoon, he was in town again and saw some more people standing around. And he asked them, why haven't you been working today? And they replied, because no one hired us. The landowner told them, then go out and join the others in my vineyard. And that evening, he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first. When those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each received a full day's wage. Isn't that scandalous? If they showed up and worked 1 hour and got a whole day's worth, I want that job. Somebody hook me up with that. And then he says, when those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed they would receive more because they had been watching what the other people who only worked an hour got. Wouldn't that make you mad? Did you notice that he paid the people who got there last, he paid them first, just so the people who got there first could see what they got? Isn't that a little bit scandalous? If somebody shows up, works for an hour, and you've been working all day in the hot sun, and they get the same thing that you get. And then he goes on to say this. When they received their pay, they protested the owner. Those people only work 1 hour, and yet you paid them just as much as you paid us to work all day in the scorching heat. Jesus, what is wrong with you? Imagine when they're listening to this story how scandalous that sounded. they are rightfully upset. And here's what the owner of the vineyard said. He said, "Friend," isn't that funny? They're in a heated debate, and he's calling them friend. You ever had somebody do that to you? Like, you know they're mad at you, you're mad at them, and they try to act like we're not cool. He said, "Friend, have I been unfair? Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. For I wanted to pay the last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous? Should you be a hater because I'm kind to other people? So those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last." Isn't that just a little bit scandalous? You can imagine how upset and how irate you would be if you stood out in the hot sun and worked all day long and somebody just showed up and worked an hour and got the same thing. And not only that, you got to watch them get their paycheck and you realize, wait a minute, he got the same thing that I agreed to work for, so surely the landowner is going to give me more because I deserve more, because that's only fair. And the reality is that we have some basic human assumptions that often start us off in the wrong place when we're trying to understand God's character. There's just three human assumptions I think we can gather from this. The first one is that they assume to know what the other workers deserve and or needed. Did you notice that the first group of people assumed to know what the other workers deserved? That they assumed to know what the other workers, the ones who worked for an hour, they assumed that they don't need the money that we got, or they don't deserve what we got because we were here first. It's a basic human assumption. They also assumed that their work was more valuable than others. We don't know how much work those guys did in that hour, do we? But they assumed that what we did was worth more than what they did. And here's the last thing. They also assumed, and this is the big one, that the owner felt the same way about the other workers that they did. And that's where we need to start. Because oftentimes our basic human assumptions make us assume that God feels the same way that we do about other people. When the reality is that God is absolutely concerned about us understanding his character and his nature for what it is and not what we assume it to be. Do you see how scandalous that is, that they showed up and worked hard and they assume that just because they got a day's wage that we're more important, we've done work that's more valuable, they don't deserve it, they don't need it, and so surely you're going to be fair and you're going to give us what we deserve. Be careful about fairness. Because fairness is based on what's deserved. You know, one of the things that God really, really is passionate about is for us to be able to understand who he is. In the book of Job, which is not the oldest story, but it is the oldest written book in the Bible, so it provides a lot of wisdom. In the book of Job, we know the story of Job. Job was being tested, and oftentimes, because we start in the wrong place, we assume that the book of Job is about Job. But the reality is that the test wasn't so much about Job, it was about God. That Satan goes to God and says, you know what, the only reason why humanity loves you, the only reason why human beings even like you is because you continue to give them stuff, and I bet that if you stop trying to manipulate people, they wouldn't love you. See, the test wasn't really about Job. The test was Satan was testing God. He's saying, you know what, you're so proud of these human beings that you created, you're so proud of the fact that you created them in your own image, and I think, God, I think that you just manipulate people into loving you, and I'm willing to bet that if you stop blessing them, there's no possible way they can love you unconditionally. And God said, okay, have you considered Job? And we know the story. Job goes on to experience some difficult things, and all throughout the 40-some-odd chapters of Job, he hears Job complain, he hears his friends complain, and God never says a word, and he never really deals with the issue until he comes to a place where they begin to say things about him that is not true. See, God is passionate about us understanding his character. Go to Job 42. Listen to what God says after all of this time of Job going through the difficulties that he went through. He says, after the Lord had finished speaking to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends, for you have not spoken accurately about me as my servant Job has. Did you notice that? That God knows when you feel like life is unfair. And God is aware of the struggles that humanity faces. And God knows when your heart is broken. And God knows when you feel a certain way. And God was not so much moved by the fact that he struggled with this situation. But here's what moved God. In the midst of that situation, you need to understand my true character. God says, you know what? It wasn't really about you being angry or you being frustrated. That's just part of life. Bad things happen sometimes to good people. But what I want you to do is understand who I really am. See, Job's friends were content on having this discussion with Job and saying, you know what? You must have done something really, really wrong. That's why God doesn't love you anymore. You must have really messed up this time, Job, because God is taking everything from you and God doesn't love you anymore. And God says, that's not how I work. That there's really nothing that you can do to make me love you anymore or any less. And so God wasn't concerned about their complaints. He was concerned that you are speaking negatively about my true character. Sometimes we have to understand when it comes to this whole scandal of the cross that we have to start in the right place. And despite all Job had experienced, God was most concerned with humanity having an accurate view of the character and the nature of God. Here's what I want you to understand. God has never claimed to be fair. That's scandalous, isn't it? Because we live with a basic human assumption that good people get good things and bad people get bad things, and the two never cross. And if I just do enough or I just give enough, that I'll never ever have to experience anything difficult about life because God is fair. But the actual opposite of fairness is grace. See, God has never really claimed to be fair, but he is good. And that's because God operates on a system that is far superior than fairness. The reality is, if we really wrestle with that for just a minute, we don't want God to be fair, do we? I mean, let's just think about that for a second. Because fairness is based on what you do or what you give. Some of us would be really messed up. Can you imagine if the system that God chose to save humanity was based on how much money you had? Woo! Some of us would be in trouble. Can you imagine if the system that God chose to save humanity was based on how much education you had? Can you imagine if the system that God chose to save humanity was based on how many days you go to church or how much you tithe or how many small group meetings you attend? Can you imagine if it was based on us? See, the place that we start is understanding that grace is not about us. As a matter of fact, fairness is more about us. It's more about what we can achieve and what we can do and how much we can give. Remember, Jesus told the parable of the vineyard because he had two issues. A man who thought that he could do enough to please God, and disciples who thought they had given enough to please God. And Jesus ends up telling this story that says life is not about fairness when it comes to God. It's about grace. Because there's nothing that you can do to earn what God has given you. And there's no amount that you or I can give to earn, to pay for, to purchase what God did for us on the cross. Life is not about fairness. It's about grace. And grace is a far superior system of dealing with the nature of humanity than fairness. So Jesus says, there's these guys who went out to work, and he brought them in, and They came in at different times, and everybody at the end of the day got the same pay. And the people and the disciples who were listening to this said, man, that is a big scandal. As a matter of fact, that's not even economically sound. You talk about a fiscal cliff. Who pays somebody a day's worth of work for 1 hour? That's not even smart business, Jesus. That's just scandalous. If it's not unfair to the workers, surely it's unfair to the vineyard owner. He's shelling out money for people who didn't do anything. Jesus says, this whole situation is not based on what is fair. It's based on God being good. There's a story of a guy who worked at a major retailer, and he goes into the stock room one morning, and he finds a young guy, probably in his 20s, sitting around and whistling. And he goes up and he asks the young man, what are you doing? It looks like you're not working. It looks like you're being lazy. And he says, I tell you what, how much money do you make in a week? The guy says, $500 a week. So he pulls out his money. He gives him $500. He said, you know what, just go. Here's the money for the rest of the week. Just go, because it just looks like you're not really doing anything. So here's the rest of your pay, go. And then the owner storms into the manager's office, and he says, I just caught this guy in the back. Looked like he wasn't working hard. He wasn't doing anything. And I just paid him out for the week, and I told him to go home. And he says, how long has that kid been working here? The manager looks at him real crazy and says, actually, he doesn't work here. He's just a delivery guy, and he was just dropping off boxes. See, one of our basic human assumptions is that in God's eyes, our work equals our worth. Don't miss that. Because one of the basic assumptions of the people in that parable was that we have worked hard, we have done everything that we're supposed to do. God, we have been to all the Bible studies, all the conferences. I've read the Bible back and forth 3 times in a year. I've done everything. I've done all the work, and my worth is found in my work. And sometimes when we're not careful, we assume that this whole Jesus thing is about how much you can do to earn his love. How much can I earn Jesus' love by what I do? Jesus tells this scandalous story about grace because he wants us to understand that there's no amount of work that you can put in that shows in his eyes how much you're worth. The guys who showed up in the beginning just assumed, and that's a basic human assumption, isn't it? Especially in the West, where we're trained to work hard. We have less vacation days than any other country. We work hard, don't we? And somehow it's ingrained in our mind and our culture that if we do enough and we spend enough time in one area or another, or we learn enough things, or we pay enough money, that we can earn God's love. And Jesus says, look, the people who showed up at the end got the same thing as the people who showed up in the beginning. Why? Because that's grace. But there's really nothing that we can do. There's really no value of our life that's attached to how much we can work. So here's what I want you to know. That anyone who would die for everyone shows us that no one is nobody. Because wouldn't it be a shame if we thought that because I worked hard and I've done this and I've done that, or because I've gotten myself together before I came to Christ and the work that I put in to transform my life, wouldn't it be sad if we thought that that's what actually made us right with God? See, the problem with that theory is that if we travel down that road long enough, then one of the biggest objections to Christianity becomes true, and that is that Christianity is an exclusive religion. That it's just about a spiritual good old boys club, and only certain people get in, and only certain people have access, and only certain people can give. And sometimes people think that just because I have put in enough time or put in enough money, that makes me right with God. But here's what God does for us. John 3:16, we know this one, don't we? That God so loved the world that he gave his only son that everyone who believes will not perish but have everlasting life. Isn't that grace? Because you notice that he didn't assign the task of Jesus saving humanity to a specific group of people. That he didn't assign the task of Jesus dying on the cross to people who did enough work or paid enough money, because that would be fair, wouldn't it? He didn't decide to send Jesus to die on the cross for people who had enough education, because according to our system, that would be fair, wouldn't it? But did you notice Jesus in his response in John 3:16 says that God loved the world so much that he gave his only son so that everyone who chooses to believe. See, grace by nature can't be exclusive. The character of God by his nature cannot be exclusive. It has never been about only you having access or only me having access, but he let his son die for anyone who chose to believe it. Doesn't that seem a lot better than fairness? Because the reality is, if it was just about being fair, and God is not fair, God is good, then it would be just for the people who did enough, who paid enough, who knew enough. For God so loved the world that he sent his son for those who had a seminary education. For God loved the world so much that he sent people who made over $100,000 a year. He's going to die for them, and the rest of y'all figure it out. For God so loved the world that he sent his son to just die for black people or for white people or for Hispanic people. No, God so loved the world that he gave his son so that everyone. That's grace. See, God has never claimed to be fair, but he is good. That he's never claimed to give you what you need based on what you have to do. God is operating on a system that is so much higher than fairness. God is not fair, but God is absolutely good. And he figures out a way to transform the world by taking a system that we often depend on and live on and flipping it on his head and saying, I'm going to give you something even though you didn't work for it. I'm going to bless you with something even though you can't afford it. I'm going to send my son to die on the cross even though you don't know enough. And Christianity is the only religion where God gives us the opportunity to believe before we have to become. See, every other religion is based on the fact that you have to become a certain person first before you can get right with God. That you have to become a scholar, or you have to become someone who's righteous, or you have to become someone who's holy. And Christianity, in the way that God operates in grace, says, all you have to do is believe and I'll help you become. There's no upfront payment. God never claimed that he's fair, but he is good. And he is gracious. There's a story of these little kids who were at a church picnic, and it was a Christian school, so the teachers had laid out all of the food on the table, and there's a certain little group of boys who were known for eating all of the food, and so they set up on the table a basket of apples, and on one end, the teacher put, we're on the honor system, so only take one apple each because God is watching. So another little mischievous boy went down there, read the sign, and went all the way down on the other end and wrote a sign that says, take all the apples you want, or take all the cookies you want, rather, because God is watching the apples. See, for some reason, we have this basic assumption about God as human beings, that God is not able to cover it all. And fairness will do that to you. The mindset of fairness will make us believe that God only has his eye on certain people and is only looking out for certain people and is only blessing certain people. But the reality is that Christianity has never been exclusive because Jesus is good enough. Can you imagine if God had 20 different ways we had to figure out how to get to him? That would almost suggest that one way in and of itself is not good enough. And so when we wrestle with the idea, why is Jesus the only way? It's because God is able in his infinite power to give us one solution for getting right with him. Now, I don't need to give you 3 different ways or 4 different ways. I don't need to figure out a multiple ways of you being able to become right with me. But in my grace, I'm just going to streamline this thing and make it simple. For God so loved the world that anyone who believes in my Son that I'm about to give to you to die for the whole entire world, if you believe that, you're good. That's because the sacrifice that Jesus made and the grace that God extends, it's always been and always will be good enough. Remember what Paul said? That in my moment of weakness and wrestling with the issue I have, I went to God and asked him to take it away, and God said what? My grace is sufficient. It's always been enough. There's no need to figure out another way, because what God did is he gave us a solution that has always been good enough. That God is not just watching over one group or another. He's not just concerned about you or me and not on the other side of the world. That he gave us a solution that is so broad, that is so wide, that is so miraculous that when Jesus died on the cross, it was good enough for humanity for all eternity. That's grace. So that means 30 years from now, it's still good. 2,000 years ago, it was good. 2,000 years from now, we're still around. It's still good. Not because a certain group of people were able to earn it, not because they were smart enough, not because a certain group of people had enough money, but the sacrifice on the cross that Jesus made and the grace that God distributes to us has been and always will be good enough. So God never said he was fair, but he's extremely good. To give us something that we don't deserve, that we haven't earned, that we can never pay for, that we can never purchase, that he doesn't actually operate off a system of fairness, because fairness would imply that you and I would actually get what we deserve. That's a scary thought, isn't it? I know some of y'all holy. When you were born, you were born saved. But there's a few of us in the room, maybe 20 or 30 of us who have a past, that we've done some things and we've seen some things and we've said some things. And if God operated off of fairness and he gave us what we deserve, God never claimed to be fair, but he is good. I had well, let me just say this before I move on. Grace means, and I already said this, but I'm going to say it again, that God cannot decide to love you any more or less than he already does. It is contrary to the nature of God, and it is contrary to the idea of grace that God's love can actually change based on your behavior. That he can't love you any more than he already does, and he can't love you any less than he already does, that it is a fixed deal. For God so loved the entire world. You can't change that. That's just who God is. That's just how God does things. And when we understand that God operates off a system of grace and not fairness, and you understand that there is absolutely nothing that you can do to stop God from loving you. Paul said it like this, that nothing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Not demons, not angels, not heaven, nor hell, not the trouble that you've gone through. And sometimes the reality is life isn't fair, but God is still good. That no matter how much you've gone through this year, last year, no matter how many experiences you've had that have been negative, no matter how many things that you walked through and it felt like God wasn't there and it felt like the world wasn't fair, Paul says, nothing can separate you from the love of God through Jesus Christ. That's grace. Can you imagine if God worked on a sliding scale? Okay, today you messed up, so I'm going to give you 70% of my love. Or I'm going to bless you with 70% of my mercy. Not all, so the other 30% you're on your own. Or can you imagine if it was about how much money you had and God said, okay, what do you got in your bank account today? All right, that's going to get you about 60% of my love today. Good luck. There's a story of a guy who died. He goes to heaven. He goes up to the gates of heaven. Peter says to him, you know what? We started working on a point system here, so you kind of tell me some of the good things you did, and if it equals up to 100 points, I'll let you in. And so the guy says, all right, that's easy. He says, all right, here's the first thing. I was married for 50 years, and I love my wife with my whole heart. I've never cheated on her, and I've dedicated my life to treating her like Christ treats the church. Peter said, man, that's awesome. That'll get you 2 points. What? Did you not hear me say 50 years? He says, well, keep going. We might add some more of the stuff. We said, all right, here we go. I've been a Christian for most of my life, and I've always paid my tithes and my offerings for at least 50 plus, 60 plus years. I've done it every time I got paid. I've given to God. Peter says, man, that is awesome. You don't have a whole lot of people who do that. He says, that's great. That'll get you another point. What? Then he says, okay, I got one. Here's a good one. I went over to Africa for a whole year, and I dug wells, and I did missionary work, and I supported the people over there, and I dedicated that whole year of my life to preaching the gospel and being a missionary. Paul, man, that is awesome. 3 points. The guy says, man, at this rate, it'll take the grace of God to get in here. See, grace gives us something that we can never earn. And whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're trying to figure this whole thing out, start in the right place where it's never really been about us. It's about what God decides to do for us. You know, the other day, and I'm almost done. The other day we were sitting down, actually yesterday, and our children have this table, a little table, and it has their little cartoon theme on it, and they sit there and they eat. Sometimes when we don't have family dinner, they sit there. And our oldest son, you know, he's a little bit stubborn. I suppose he may have gotten some of that from me. But he has his spot that he sits in, and he has his chair. I don't even know how they can tell which chair is different from the other. They both look the same to me. But he knows this is my chair, this is my spot. Well, yesterday they sat down, and our youngest wanted to sit and have a nice view of the television. And so instead of sitting in his corner, he sat right beside his brother, and they had to kind of share some elbow room. And you can tell at first that his face, you know, his face kind of changed. The oldest one, and he was a little bit upset, and he's a little bit stubborn, like, this is my spot, I'm not moving. You need to get in. Maybe he got his personal space issues from me, I'm just saying. And he sat down, and after a while, he just couldn't take it anymore. He just had to get up and move. And I realized that, you know what, maybe he learned some of his stubbornness from his dad, but I think that's also just basic human nature. But I want to say something else that is real scandalous. God is equally as stubborn. And the scandal of grace is not that God is stubborn because he doesn't love us. The scandal of grace is God is stubborn because he loves us. See, God will give up his son before he gives up on you. Don't miss that. That God's love is absolutely stubborn. He is relentless in his pursuit to finding a way to bring you into his heavenly kingdom. And he would much rather give up his son to die on the cross for you than to give up on you. That God is stubborn. He says, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. I'm not moving from this spot. And if it takes for me to give up my own son to die for the sins of the world so that when they believe in him, they can be with me forever, that's how much I love. God is stubborn. I will give up my son before I give up on you. That's a scandal of grace. Is that it's not about fairness. It's not about what you can do. It's not about what I can do. It's not about how much money I have. It's not about me becoming a holy and righteous person. But Jesus said, if you just believe, that's good enough. That's the sacrifice that can cover the sins of an entire world. God is absolutely stubborn in the fact that I would rather give up my son before I give up on humanity. Because that's grace. I want us to just take a moment and we're going to pray that we're done. Because I think sometimes the people that we deal with, and maybe there's some in here today that are kind of trying to explore this whole Christianity thing, and I don't understand, I don't get it, because life is not fair and God is not fair and things don't always work out in my favor, and God never claimed to be fair, but he is good. And he gives us an opportunity to experience his wonderful, miraculous grace, despite the fact that we could never repay him for what he did. God would rather give up his son than to give up on you. Let's pray. God, we thank you, and we love you, and we thank you for this wonderful scandal of grace, this system that transcends fairness, this system that says that it's not about what you deserve, it's not about how you can work hard for me, it's not about the money that you can give to me, it's about the fact that I love you so much and I'm unwilling to relent my love for you. And because of that, I'll give you everything that you need to get right with me. God, we thank you so much for grace. We thank you that you didn't leave it up to humanity to figure out on our own how we could be right with you, but you took the initiative and you allowed your grace to be extended to us in such a miraculous way that it transcends everything that we've ever known about you. We thank you for your heart and your character, that you don't give us what we deserve, but yet you give us better than what we deserve. And so, God, we thank you, and we love you so, so much. And help us to learn how to embrace the grace that you've extended to us, and help us to learn how to extend that same grace to others. God, we thank you, and we love you. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Now, make sure that you, as always, check out the Life Guide this week. As Pastor Larry has talked a little bit more about grace. And this week, find opportunities to share the gospel with someone else. And let them know that, you know what, God would rather give up his son than give up on you. Have a blessed week. If you're going to Community 101, we'll start in just a second. Have a blessed week. God bless you.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.